So what I'll try to do is, guys, I'll try and pose a question each to you. Feel free to kind of contribute. This is not as per the buckets that we've discussed. Then I'd like the audience also to ask you guys some questions. So to begin with, let me start with Biju, since you're the senior most. I had to crack that too. No, so I think there is something that is common in all 5 projects and in a sense in all 5 methodologies that you guys adopt. It seems to me that all of you have choose to focus a lot more on sectional understanding of the building rather than a plan understanding of the building. And if those of who are us are here who've taught in architecture colleges understand that unimaginably large amount of time goes in architecture studios and so-called resolving the plan. So in practice, when you guys have to think through sections, does that pose, do you find that liberating? Do you find that that's a sort of cross you have to bear to achieve the architecture you guys want? Do you have a tough time convincing? I noticed 2 of you, Akshay and Biju, have done their damnedest in architecture school. So is there any kind of confrontation from the people you're building for about this? Because it seems like a waste of FAR, right? So is there some math involved that you guys have to think about?
No, I think it's a matter of, I talked about it very briefly during the presentation, that when in our context, I think a lot of our work is about the context within which we practice. And what I meant by is not the site context, but the socio-political, economic context that within which we practice today. So if you look at India, for example, it has 2% of global land, I talked about it, but 18% of world's population, So at a fundamental level as a practice, we believe that we can't talk about sustainability without talking about density. Right? Because if we can take care of 18% of world's population's needs in 2% of land, it's a wonderful sustainable way of living. So for me, it is an opportunity and not as a constraint. What does that mean? Does that mean that our cities have to look the way it is? Which means that the section straight away comes into play when you start to look at creating spaces. For us, architecture, fundamental purpose of architecture is to create spaces that allows people to come together. So if you have to do that you have to challenge the traditional figure-ground relationship. In other words, most of our work, I talked about, the ground is actually within the figure. It's not your traditional figure ground. And hence, when we teach students, the next generation of students, how do you draw a figure ground? What does that figure ground means? And if you look at our building regulations, it's completely against the notion of a collective city. It says that you take your land. It's the inverse of a traditional figure ground. Right? Our building bylaw says take the object, take the figure and put it in the middle, which is the smallest part of your land. And hence the pressure on the density is more. Right? So, and all our margins becomes parking area. So we completely took away every public space. So without section, I don't think we can create, especially if you have to negotiate density, we can create spaces that allows people to come together. And for us, it is actually a wonderful new way of looking at things. And I always talk about this, that when you work in contexts which are limiting, or challenges which are limiting, it also opens up opportunities for us to look at new models of development.
Sure.
And I think that's...
Yeah, so I think the point that I think comes across really strongly in your work and what you just said is that, in a sense, when we work so hard to resolve the plan, what we are actually doing is an FAR allocation. But the moment we start conceiving buildings in section, the imperative of that conversation is always going to be density. Who is living on top? How many people are living on top of each other?
Correct. And
right?
It's a matter of, we do a lot of work with not too many developers, very few, but we do a lot of work with them. I think, and none of them will build a building which doesn't achieve the FSI or which doesn't. So I think it's a matter of how we handle that density. It's about smartly organizing where that space opens up, like Smaran or like Akshay talked about. When it opens up directly from your unit, it has a different relationship, right? So, but it is still free of FSI if it's open to sky, right? It doesn't have to be all on the top. So it's a matter of how one it's a lot of hard work, of course, but it's a matter of how one organizes that density.
Smaran, to that point, I think you made the very cool thing of architecture, in a sense, going from being, or a facade being skin deep to it being thought of as a deep skin. Again, there's a question of section. but then you also spoke very evocatively about a certain social condition in India. And the fact that facades are, in a sense, statements. They're outwardly expressions. They very much carry what the building stands for as a statement, as a visual statement. And you've resorted to kind of looking, I've looked at some of your other projects, that you often work with this idea of manipulating this facade as an occupiable space. And you kind of indicated that you thought of that as an autonomous space. So how does that, so, you know, at a certain level, a lot of what contemporary architecture talks about is opening up and democratizing, you know, spaces and stuff. So do you see this idea of autonomous space being something that is the antithesis of that? Would this sort of tangent of occupiable facade and a sort of creation of a micro ecosystem lend itself to more and more fortification that we've seen, or do you see that in some way liberating some sort of social boundary or border or something? So how do you see that?
Well, in a lot of ways, I think you see a lot of verandas, you know, traditionally, which really was that thick edge between inside and outside, you know, and that negotiation of the inside and outside and people occupying it and the connection to the street was a really nice sort of porous buffer or threshold that was always created and people were used to it. The fact that today you have this high compound wall and you shun away, because let's face it, our cities are not really, that you don't really shake hands with the street. You turn away and look the other side. So I think in a certain sense, this thickening of the skin and this idea of having this deep skin, or let's say the idea of occupying the poche, is in some sense kind of reconnecting to the outside, except in a much more through a controlled lens, so to speak. So this microclimate or this oasis or this immersive experience, if you can create in that thickness, I think it kind of lends itself well to the kind of connection you make to the outside, you know?
That's actually interesting. Now that you talk about it, there is always this confrontation between the sort of modernist idea of transparency, openness, of being, you know, sharing everything you have with what you have around you, or on the other hand, like Villa Savoy, controlling enough ground around the building so that it doesn't matter if all your windows are on your facade is really open. And how that sits onto a sort of Indian sense of what privacies mean in our cities, mean for all of us. And, you know, the idea that an occupied, I mean, you know, it's a standard kind of trope that one says the Hawa Mahal is a facade that is an occupiable facade. But, you know, the idea that one can actually make a more nuanced connection with the city while preserving essential privacies that exist within our own cultures. So, you know, and I want to take that to Vasanth also, because you spoke about Karnal. Now, Karnal, unfortunately, Delhi being as large as it is and as influential as it is, it's more to the detriment of peri-urban Delhi. So, or in your case, Karnal being peri-urban to Delhi and Chandigarh. So, in a sense, a lot of the detritus of architecture gets built in smaller towns because, so how did you look at this idea that the facade has to be a statement facade? Because clearly it is, and you know, is there some sense that the statement can be large if the understanding of material is more in minute? That, you know, there's a lot of play of textures and the bricks really dance along the building. So is there a sense of that? And in the rest of Firki's work, I've seen a kind of constant theme of the brick. Is it that you're trying to exhaust all potential in that material, or what's leading you into that idea of micro patterning to kind of derive a statement?
I think one by one, I think starting why brick. Whether it's fortunate or unfortunate, a lot of our clients are poor. And we've realized that, I mean, I personally, or at least at our studio, we love the way brick ages. And I think all architects do. We all want to, I mean, it all started with a fascination to do one brick building at some time. And then it ended up, you know, being in that zone where you're able to push what brick can be used like. I mean, even Vinu's works demonstrate that. I mean, it's, I mean, if you take any material, maybe it's just a fascination for the moment that we are using brick. Maybe at some other time we might be pushing some other material to its, into something that we have not seen. But, and also, and talking about the statement of the facade itself, I think as architects we take a lot of things very seriously. I mean, the idea of designing, idea of concepts, and all this. And I think at our studio, I think the way the guys and the team are, I think it's sometimes just a fun expression, and it just and it ends up being. I mean, it just happened by chance that we thought, why can it not be something just about a curiosity to know what happened, and we just started sketching it out, and that was a sketch that I'd shown, and it ended up being a statement because it was something that was not done of this kind, something twisting like that. It ended up being a statement, but as such, it wasn't. And the takeaway for me from this project was that the guys who actually built it, it was a statement for them more than me, because the guy who had never done an exposed brick building till date is now the guy who's doing exposed brick buildings, in and out in Karnal. And I mean that act. So I think I'm really proud of that. And now he's got so much work. Now he doesn't work with us anymore.
He's taking over the brick. No, great. I think there is that sense of. So I want to take that thought of this idea that material cost, a familiarity with material technology as a way of building, that's as a form of self-discovery. I want to take that to Vinu in a little while. But just before we do that, something Smaran also said about micro ecosystems. Akshay, you're the roof of this Manipal school. You've understood it as social extensions to the studio, basically because your land is contoured and therefore the roof of one becomes the terrace of the other. And then you've looked at the ecological potential of growing food in a place like Manipal. Do I have a voiceover? Someone is checking their mic. Okay, so I just want you to kind of tell me that there are the other works that you've done, and you and I spoke about it. Vanam, for example, which is an apartment stack in the middle of urban Bangalore, wherein you seem to have invested in looking at the balcony as a sort of a garden adjunct to spaces in the. So most of us think of apartment stacks where you have balconies where then you put a potted plant, but literally in your case, the balcony in its entirety is a pot for a garden. So, are technically as a sort of modernist technique to kind of, take the greens with you to different levels, right? Like if Biju's project takes social connections to different levels, yours is definitely about taking ecosystems to different levels. Two questions to you on that front. Firstly, do you find it that is something that has actually kind of evolving into a USP people are coming to you for those ideas like that, especially post-pandemic? And secondly, there's always been this pushback in architecture about greenwashing. A lot of architects, especially in their 3Ds, kind of decorate the entire facade with, they have trees in impossible places. I noticed a couple in your presentation. So technically, do you feel that there is a lot of learning we need to do in architecture to be able to mount these things? Do you think that there is something that is perhaps locally understood of kind of being able, because Manipal, I'm sure, growing stuff in Manipal is part of people's culture. You refer to cultural connection. So these 2 points, if you could respond.
I just want to add that his wife and partner is a landscape architect, so he doesn't have a choice.